For centuries, people have predicted the end of the world. Comets, computer bugs, ancient calendars, you name it, we've heard it. And yet, here we are. So why do these doomsday predictions keep coming? And what in the world happens to the believers when the big day comes and goes, right? It's a fascinating puzzle. What makes these prophecies so incredibly powerful? And maybe the even bigger question is, what goes through someone's mind when the prophesied date passes and, well, nothing happens? Let's dive into the history and the psychology behind it all. You know, being skeptical about someone nailing down the exact date for the apocalypse is not a new thing. This sentiment has been around for pretty much as long as the predictions themselves. It's this constant voice saying, yeah, we've heard this one before. But there's always another voice, one that's just as powerful. And that's the voice that says, but this time is different. People who believe look at the world today and say, sure, there have always been disasters, but not like this. Not with this intensity, all happening at once. And it's this tug of war between history and the feeling of a unique, urgent present that really gets our story started. To really get our heads around this, we're going to start with one of the most famous examples in American history. It's the story of the Millerites, a movement that had thousands of people absolutely convinced they knew the exact day Jesus was coming back. So for more than 10 years, this preacher, William Miller, built up a huge following with his sermons. He actually set an initial date, which quietly passed, but that didn't stop them. Nope. For people like Henry Emmons, who had sold everything they owned to prepare their souls, this wasn't just like getting a math problem wrong. It was a crushing physical devastation. Okay, let's jump ahead in time. Almost 150 years later, we see a much more modern case. The fears are different. Now we're talking nuclear war, not divine cleansing. But you're going to see that the pattern is almost identical. The Church Universal and Triumphant, led by a woman named Elizabeth Clare Prophet, went all in on the full-blown survivalist strategy. This wasn't just about getting right with God. This was about building underground shelters, stockpiling supplies, and even arming themselves for a very specific, predicted catastrophe. So what was their prediction? They believed the world had racked up so much negative karma that it was going to trigger a nuclear first strike from the Soviet Union. Prophet even claims that all the positive reforms happening in the USSR at the time were just a smokescreen for this sneak attack. The level of commitment here was just staggering. The church spent around $12 million on a massive underground shelter complex out in Montana. We're talking decontamination rooms, armored trucks, and enough food to last for 7 years. People quit their jobs, sold their homes, and poured everything into this project. Okay, just try to picture this scene. Thousands of people are crammed into this bunker. The prophesied hour comes and goes. There's just silence. And instead of relief, there's this tense desperation. In fact, Prophet's own daughter later recalled that her mother in that moment was actually pleading for the prophecy to come true, literally asking an archangel to let the bombs descend. So what happens then? The world keeps spinning. The bombs don't fall. How does a belief system possibly survive something like that? Well, this is where the human psychology gets really interesting. Check out how both of these groups handled it. Instead of saying, oops, we're wrong, they just reinterpreted the failure. For the Millerites, the date was right, but the location was wrong. Jesus didn't come to earth. He started cleansing a sanctuary in heaven for the Church Universal and Triumphant. The nuclear attack was totally real, but their prayers were so powerful they prevented it. In both cases, a failed prediction gets spun into a spiritual victory. Psychologists have a name for exactly this situation. It's called cognitive dissonance. It's that awful, uncomfortable feeling you get when you hold two conflicting ideas in your head at the same time. Like, I believe this with all my heart, and also the evidence shows this is wrong. That mental stress is so intense that for many people, it's actually easier to change how they see the evidence than to give up the core belief they've invested so much in. And the fallout is huge. Believers are often left with nothing. They face mockery from the outside world. They're financially ruined, and their communities break apart. And yet, Crazily enough for some, the failed prophecy only makes their commitment stronger, and they go out and try to convert others to their new revised belief with even more passion. Seeing this pattern over and over again forces us to ask a much deeper question. What if we've been thinking about the whole point of prophecy completely wrong? I mean, is that the whole story? Are prophecies just a long history of people getting it wrong? Well, it turns out this tension between what's predicted and what actually happens goes all the way back to the source for many of these beliefs, the Bible itself. Let's take the ancient city of Tyre, for instance. The prophet Ezekiel delivered a very clear, very specific prophecy. The king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, was going to completely wipe it off the map. But history, and actually the book of Ezekiel itself, tells a very different story. You can see the disconnect right there in the text. The first prophecy in chapter 26 is absolutely total destruction. But then years later, another chapter basically says, yeah, so that siege didn't really work out. The prophecy is then updated on the fly. God says he'll give Nebuchadnezzar the entire nation of Egypt as a consolation prize instead. This has led some theologians to argue that maybe we're missing the point. What if the goal of prophecy was never about being a perfect crystal ball, but about communicating a divine message about what's happening on earth right now? In other words, the prophecy against Tyre wasn't trying to be a history book written before it happened. It was a moral statement. It was a warning against the arrogance of powerful nations. Whether the city's walls actually fell was less important than delivering that core message. And that brings us to a really mind-bending place. If prophecies can be factually wrong but still inspire millions of people across centuries, then their real power isn't about predicting the future. It's about shaping our present. They give us meaning when things feel chaotic. They give us a sense of purpose. They give us a grand story to feel a part of. Maybe there are less about when the world will end, and a lot more about how we're supposed to live in it. Right here, right now.